Right, let's get this finished. This doesn't get any better, any of this stuff, unfortunately. So, again, drawing on my old boss, Helen, who wrote a lot about Lara Croft and has done a significant amount of research about Lara Croft over the years. It's kind of Helen's career is basically Lara Croft's career. Helen's argument, and I think it's a valid one, draws our attention to when we actually have female protagonists in games. And her argument always was that watching Lara Croft is not the same as playing Lara Croft, that if you have a protagonist that you are actively playing as a game, it changes your relationship and how you understand the representation itself, because you have that nexus of activity with the character and you are controlling the character. To a certain extent, Helen argues that the representational form kind of withdraws a little bit, that you don't pay attention to the ridiculous physicality that they've invested in, because the original 1996 Lara Croft is ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous. Can anyone, I don't know of a polite way of saying this, so for those watching the recording, I do apologise, and I apologise to everyone in this room in advance. Why the pointy tits? I don't know of a better way of saying it. Why? What the... What is going on? Does anyone... Well, I think there is something underlying this, but you guys are too young to know my reference here. 1989, Madonna, Blonde Ambition. Yeah, okay, a couple of these ringing a bell with a couple of you. But that was a deliberate thing by Madonna to say, like, you know, but Madonna's thing was like, you are all focusing on my tits, my face is up here. Yeah. So she made her body look ridiculous in particular ways to kind of parody what the entertainment industry and how they objectified her, and how, because that was her whole thing, playing around with that notion of sexuality and objectification. She was always trying to subvert the objectifications which were put on her. I always found it kind of bizarre in Tomb Raider how, like, they took that and thought, oh, this looks good. There was no reason, I mean, you might not think it with the face, but there was no reason to have this angularism going on here. We'd already moved past that in terms of characterization. The character would have looked a little more cartoon-like, and they were trying to go for a realism which wasn't really capable in that generation of consoles, I would argue. But the realism... Does she have a waist? Were you just looking at that?
Realism, that hit to boob ratio.
She'd never be able to fucking stand up. I mean, talk about back pain. She'd have about 8 hernias. You know, herniated discs you'd be able to play a xylophone on her back. It'd be ridiculous. Has anyone seen any of the movies? The Tomb Raider movies? You know, Angelina Jolie is a very attractive woman. Even she looks ridiculous in those films. I don't know what corset they put her in, but she has no waist at all in those movies. And, I mean, the push-up bra in those movies must have got scaffolding in it. I'm telling you, there's not just underwire. Holy shit. Even the relaunch in 2018, I think, is really problematic. Because it's still playing on the same tropes again. But playing Lara different to watching Lara. So, what Helen is arguing, I think, is that you create a character of this kind. The playing experience is different to the marketing experience. There is a direct form of marketing going on here where you construct a character in this way so that the character can be looked at, and indeed Helen draws on Mulvey to argue that this is a classic form of male gaze with regards to the character. In terms of playing, particularly in like Tomb Raider 1 and 2, there's nothing really female about the character at all. Yeah, classically, what Lara Croft as a character does is the same as what a million men do in different video games. In fact, the game is a fairly poor rip-off, I would argue, of Zelda just with some shooting elements in it, which you don't get in the Zelda series. But actually, in terms of the puzzles and so on, and what you're asked to do, it's a fairly transparent rip-off of those games. What all they've done, basically, all Codemasters did at the time was just put a female character in and give her massive tits. That's it. And they're not even, I mean, massive triangular, polygonal tits, which is bonkers. As 2018, you can shape them better, obviously, but it's the same argument going through. Tomb Raider sold a huge amount and did, in fairness, have a major cultural impact. But who was it aimed for? Who is that for?
Heterosexual men.
Of course it is, yeah. When I started in uni here in 1999, there was a bloke living upstairs from me who had a poster of Lara Croft on his wall. I was like, dude, if you're going to jerk off, I'll get you a poster of a real woman. It's not a problem, but that's just weird. I'm not into it. I didn't even think the games were that good. We have, then, the other classic trope of women in video games. Character? Peach. I mean, she's so forgetful. She's so clumsy.
There's nothing about her character that I think, oh, that's so Peach. She's just...
Classic Peach.
That's classic Peach to get kidnapped by a violent, deranged dinosaur. Oh, that Peach. So regular. Regular as clockwork. You can guaranteed in virtually every AAA game out there that you will be asked to do this mission in some kind. At some stage, if you put 50, 60 quid down for a video game, you're going to be asked to do this at some point. That you've got to rescue the poor clueless woman who's got herself kidnapped. Yeah? It's in everything. Resident Evil asks you to do it. Red Dead Redemption 2 asks you to do it about 4 or 5 times, if I remember correctly. GTA asks you to do it. Fucking Metal Gear asks you to do it several times across that series. Again and again. Every Mario game asks you to do it. Everyone asks you to do this. Even my blessed Sonic the Hedgehog has to do it occasionally as well. Why? I mean, we're familiar with the trope. Why? Why is the big question.
Do you think that it's a male power fantasy to
Take the word fantasy out and I'm with you.
Well, there we go then. Do you think it appeals to men to feel like...
It's a reinforcement, right, of a particular subject position that men and women have in society. That ideological perspective is called what? Begins with a P and is something that we should smash. It's a patriarchal position, right? That women's position is subordinate to men. She doesn't get kidnapped by women. Let's make that abundantly clear here, right? Peach doesn't get outsmarted by a woman. She gets outsmarted by... I know I'm stretching the definition of man here, but that's a masculine character, right? So it's you're right. There's a power dynamic, unquestionably. But that power dynamic is related to a wider power dynamic, I would argue, a patriarchal view of women in society, that women are purely there to be protected. Because why? Why do women need to be protected? Because, they can't do shit on their own.
But does that do it for anyone? Growing up playing Mario, you never, reinforcing it to yourself again and dominant over Peach. You jumped on turtle.
Don't conceptualize it in that way, perhaps. Maybe that's not the message which people take from it. You play a lot of these games when you're younger, you're not thinking you're dominant over Peach, but when you start your first relationship, say it's with a female, what's your attitude towards that female? Maybe that's the conceptualization that we need to focus on. That, you know, I'm going to look after you. You know, I'm going to keep you safe. Like, women can look after themselves. Women can be safe on their own. They don't need men to make them safe. You know, you can look after yourself, can't you? Yeah. I know, it's a horrible world out there for women, but you know what to do. You know, you don't need a man. Maybe the whole answer to the game is women need men, or bad shit will happen to them. There's plenty of women out there who haven't got men who are doing just fine. Yeah. So maybe it's the message here is refined a little, you know, and it's how we encounter, you know, the amount of bizarre patriarchal behaviour I see in this workplace would just blow your mind. Where it's like very capable colleagues, you know, with doctorates are treated as if they're schoolgirls. You know, oh, you can't do that trip on your own. She's fucking 40. Yes, you can. You know, do you know what? And you see it all the time. Now, I'm not saying those guys played Mario when they were kids. I think other media reinforces this message, but I think this is a message which is reinforced through games as well. Jordan.
Well, do you think it has a kind of not negative but sort of effect on men as well? Because in personally for them, do you feel like they feel in order to be masculine, I need to.
I really think that's the argument I'm tapping into. I think the effect for men is really negative. In fact, both these classic representations of women in games, they're massively problematic in terms of how women are represented. But I think the net effect of those representations is really negative for men. Because, and I think the broad stereotype of gamer is kind of correct here, that these kind of games are largely marketed towards young men. The messages which are continually repeated, therefore, shape, to an extent, there are other cultural forms which shape this as well, but they do have an effect on shaping how men see, in particular, their relationship to women. Not necessarily women as an object, which is really problematic in itself. But also then we're into the nexus of how do men relate to women through this active media form, you know, which if you follow, for example, Ian Bogost's argument about procedural rhetoric, this shapes how we understand our relationship with women themselves, because these are persuasive texts which shape, you know, how do I stand in relation to women? As a protector, once you follow that line of as a protector, how much toxic behaviour do men exhibit in relationships when they take that role? Because as a protector is then interpreted as, well, in order to protect, I need to monitor, I need to police, I need to be with all times, I need to shut down anything problematic that I think is going to be problematic, like friendships, you know, etc., etc. You know, we talk about red flags, right? I've just mentioned 4 classic ones, right? Well, it's hardly surprising in some ways that men do act in that way, because that is continually reinforced through the media they consume, and in particular the games they play. That is a reinforcement which goes on over and over. I'm not making the gaming industry complicit in the construction of that. But what I'm suggesting here is this continual replay of this trope is not helpful in that way. By stripping women of agency in how they're represented in the things that we engage with, you are simply opening the door to that. Now, there are a number of other factors as well. But yeah, to agree 1,000,000% with your supposition, I think this is really negative. I think it's awfully negative for men.
Is there a strong female character in the Mario series?
Of course not.
Just thinking that, I can't think of one.
No, I couldn't think of one. I went through that exercise when I was putting these slides together to try and think if there was something that series, to be fair, probably the biggest selling video game series in history, has ever done to subvert that paradigm? I can't think of anything. You could argue perhaps that the Mario Kart series does not include it. I'm not even sure about that, to be honest. The female characters in that tend to be a bit easier to bump off the track. So I'm not even actually that convinced by that. So, yeah, I don't think so. I think most series of games don't address this. And they continually... It was antiquated 40, 50 years ago, this. You know. But it continually gets repeated as a trope. And we do, as a society, have these weird discussions about why young men in particular, you know, I'm not targeting anyone in this room, by the way, okay? Don't feel targeted. But there are genuine discourses in society about why young men in particular display toxic traits in relationships. Well, there's plenty of fucking clues. I mean, there's lots of clues out there about why this happens, you know? And, you know, I'm not saying this is an easy answer to any of those questions, but please take into account what we ask games which, as I've argued, are marketed and constructed on the impression that it is going to be a certain dynamic of men that's going to play them. What we're asking those men to do in those games with regards to women is just as problematic. So, I've talked about the sales fallacy already. Developers feel that a game that features a cast of characters with nuanced, diverse representation simply won't sell. Logic of playing it safe means for predominantly white heterosexual characters is widely acknowledged within the research. So the industry, I just want to reiterate there. According to accounts from the industry itself, they've stated that including a more diverse cast would require deeper backstories, i.e. more money spent, more complex game to create, which apparently the game industry doesn't have the time or resources for. The game industry does not have the time or resources to tell a story that could allow for different representations. That takes up too much effort. Much easier for us to do this. That's hugely problematic, of course, because it means that any non-white, non-heterosexual character, regardless of gender, requires some deep explanation as to why they're in the game in the first place. Even that perspective is really problematic. Basically, the games industry says, if we include any non-white, non-heterosexual character in the game, we got to explain to you why we're doing this. You can't accept from the outset that this character has these representative forms. We got to tell you why. You don't have to tell me why. I don't give a fuck. I'm an adult. I'm fully aware there are people who are not like me. I'm okay with that. You know, it would be quite difficult to operate as an adult if you weren't okay with that. But of course, this is something which, you know, white, privileged, heterosexual characters, we don't have to fill in those gaps, because that's normal. See how problematic that is? That's normal. Being white and heterosexual is not normal. That is just a certain set of characteristics. That is not normality. There is no such thing as normality when it comes to characteristics of race or sexuality or gender. Unless you exist in a patriarchy, in which certain ideas are imposed on you. The industry is basically just toxic in how it sees human beings. And it does have an idea of what is normal. And it's clearly delineated. So there are significant obstacles, therefore, in blocking LGBTQIA culture. You know, that can come down to countries that have made it illegal. Don't underestimate the games industry considering sales in countries like Qatar, for example, where we have the World Cup at the moment. Don't underestimate the games industry looking at cultures where, you know, there is suppression of the LGBTQIA community in particular, and thinking, well, we don't want to limit our sales. We don't want to cut off these industries, so we're not going to go there. Basically, because if we do that, that's going to cut us down. There's also the fact that not all communities in the gaming audience are going to be as welcoming to mainstream LGBTQIA content as seen by the industry itself. That's Shaw's argument here, that the industry sees, or our community, our lovely gaming community that we cater for, is not going to accept these characters, therefore we're not going to have them. Shaw argues that we should stop letting developers off the hook for not including LGBTQIA characters and stories and culture into games, saying it's not the job of marginalised audiences to hold these people's hands and direct them as to what should be in games, that they should grow up and realise that it is the 21st century, not the fucking 1950s. The easy way to increase representation would be to simply make games with these minority groups in mind. To change that ethos of what Player 1 is. That would be the easiest game to address this. Adrian Shaw actually argues that probably that's not the best way to go about this. That would create further marginalisation within the game market, as you'd end up with games specifically targeted at that particular section of gamers, causing further exclusion. If the gaming industry wants to compete with other mediums in regards to representation, it's going to need to let go of market concerns and commercial viability and just do it. Give us characters who actually represent everybody, not just specific identities. If you start thinking about making games for this community or that community, it is just a variation of the market principle. Think, right, I've got my big AAA game here, now it's not addressing this community, so I'm going to make them another game, which will sell well amongst those people. You've just actually amplified the marginalisation at that point. So Adrienne Shaw's argument is, please let's not go down the route of making, I think she uses the term, gay games in the book. Instead, actually change the fucking games in the first place. Grow a pair, realise that your sales fallacy is a fallacy in itself, you will sell, and start doing this properly. And that will have an exponential effect on the culture of games if you start doing this. Games industry has not responded to Shaw and other people who have called for this. Queer coding, also known as queer baiting, is also a major problem in the development of games. This practice is very commonplace within the wider anime game market, and the term has two main things. Firstly, the practice of a character being coded in a way that presents them as being LGBTQIA, but is never canonically stated as being as such. So you allude to a character being gay, but you never actually flesh that out. This has been interpreted as being a form of queer baiting. That, you make ideas that this character might not be heterosexual, but you never actually follow that through in some way. That usually relies on some really outdated tropes and stereotypes about people to make those associations for the player without actually doing it. That's really problematic because then you have stereotypical representations, not actual realistic representations. And it's used to keep LGBTQIA audiences interested without actually making any legitimate progress at all. So you throw a bone, say, hi, I'll keep, we do have gay characters. Yeah, we don't actually have, we're not going to call them that. We're not going to let them have any kind of lifestyle or any kind of agency of any kind, but we're going to make it look like we've thought about this in some way. Does anyone play Fire Emblem?
My sister plays it and she complains about the queer baiting in it all the time.
There you go. Yeah, it's endemic in that series. Queerness is something added in by the player in these games rather than something the developers give. But it's so problematic, this whole thing. You add these tropes. Basically, you say, here's a stereotype. You can add that if you want, If you pair a character up with somebody of the same sex, you're effectively removing an entire aspect of the gameplay as well. In that series, you basically chop yourself off from half the game.
Yeah, you can't have children without hetero.
Absolutely, yeah. Which, it's like, okay, let's think about that for a second. Why can't homosexual people have children? Because they can. There's nothing problematic about that at all. According to the Fire Emblem series, no, gay people can't have children. Don't be ridiculous. What the fuck? You know, and yeah, just... Okay, so, let's try and answer some of these questions. 1. What games are for women?
Games on your phone.
Like?
Homescapes.
Hmm?
Homescapes.
Home. You play that, don't you?
Oh,
Yeah, you do.
Project Makeover.
Project Makeover, yeah. that's
Project.
right.
What the fuck is Project Makeover?
I've seen it advertised, I've not played it.
Is this like?
I've played it. It's like you just get a bunch of people, then you like make them glow up and stuff. They're
Oh, that
mostly
sounds so
women.
good. Is it free?
Yeah.
I'm gonna download this. This sounds amazing. Okay. What other games are for women?
Like Control, like more arty games, like Animal Crossing, like really focus on like your art and stuff.
Animal Crossing. Yeah. Animal Crossing is what do you do?
It's kind of like get to know your little villages, make everyone happy, design your house. It's nice, wholesome.
Wow.
It's nice.
So what is that telling us about women's role in society?
Decorate house and plants.
Oh yeah.
Think logically for what Cheska just said, right? You kind of set up a home and make everyone happy and, you know, make sure everyone's okay. So you're basically playing a domestic agent.
Pretty much.
I wonder if the patriarchy has any concept like that.
You pay a mortgage though, so technically there's a bit of realism in that.
Technically a bit of realism in there, yeah. Okay. Look, I don't even think Animal Crossing is one of the more problematic examples, but when you dig into the logics of the game, the ludology of it itself, there is something a little bit problematic here, I think. Are there any other games for women? I would argue that there are, and when we investigate why, it's kind of bizarre. I'd say the Just Dance series. In fact, there's a whole series of like kinetic games which have been marketed towards women. Just Dance is the one that always comes to mind with me, anyway. And has anyone used it? Yeah. What do you do in Just Dance? What
Dance.
You
Makes it a
dance.
drinking game as well.
Yeah, I can see how it's a good drinking game. Yeah, it would be pretty funny. And the same that Wii Sports was only good if you'd had like 8 cans of lager before doing it, because that was awesome. But then the telly would end up broken because somebody would be doing the bowling and sling the controller, come out their hand, smash the TV. It's a whole thing. Just Dance, marketed towards women. What is the purpose of Just Dance? It's exactly the same purpose as Wii Fit.
Oh,
Hmm?
to keep fit.
Keep fit, yeah. Lose weight. Get a dance body. That's the purpose of Just Dance, basically, as far as I can see. It's really, really problematic, as far as I can see. What games are for LGBTQIA people? Are there any?
I think even though it was basically a commercial failure, I think Cyberpunk 2077 had a really good diversity in the game.
Explain.
Well, starters, in the avatar creation, you can choose your genitals, your voice, and then there's so many different characters, like different romance interests, and it's like not like you should go for the straight one. You could, there's no pressure on you. You can go for what you like.
Yeah, it opens up possibilities. I don't think if that game was better, it would have been. I don't particularly. I don't want to give them a huge amount of credit for this, albeit I think those programmers do deserve some credit. They could have made a better game, and they could have grounded this kind of behaviour a lot better. Because I gave up on it. I thought it was just intensely boring. But I kind of constructed a character which, if I was to deconstruct the character I created, I think queer would be a fairly good, descriptive adjective for how I made that character. Not necessarily, I didn't really set out to do that. I just wanted to play around with the characterization a lot and kind of make a kind of different character to ones I'm given. But it didn't stop the game from being a steaming pile of shit, unfortunately, because it's just so dull. So I might have liked to see my character through, but I just could not be bothered because it was just so intensely boring. I don't know. If Project made that game for that, I'd be amazed, though. I think it's an interesting feature.
It's quite progressive, but then like the lesbian character Judy still was kind of objectified in the sex scene. Like
Very.
that's the thing, though. So like, I want to argue it's
Yeah.
good, but it's not. But it was a sex scene, so I mean, like.
Then that's a cultural thing, right? In wider media culture, lesbians are sexually objectified by men. Is that a fair thing to say? Why? Lesbians have no interest in men. That's why they're lesbians. That's the whole thing. Do you know what I mean? It's like, they don't want to... What the fuck? Anyway, okay. Are there any games for non-white people? Difficult for us as a group, perhaps, to understand this, but... Anything?
There's a lot of Life is Strange that's focused on those two boys. I think they were Puerto Rican.
Yeah.
It was on that culture media. I'm not sure.
I mean, it's interesting to me, the episode you're talking about, because it's one of the few games, I would argue, which has non-white characters as the exclusive focus. Usually a non-white character is a conduit to a white character in some way. It's like the Bechdel test with films, right? You look at, do women have conversations between one another which don't relate to a man or anything like that? And I think you can apply that to video games in particular with non-white characters. Do they have any agency outside of the white characters in the game? And it's one of the few examples, I think, where that does occur. That said, I don't think there's anything. I genuinely don't think that category of games exist. I mean, I think you can pinpoint there are some games which are for women. That in itself is really problematic when you analyse what those games are. I don't think there are any games out there that target LGBTQIA people in any way, shape or form. I don't think they, unless you look deep into indie production and indie games. And even then, I don't want to shit on indie game producers because they do a really good job about diversity in games, but very often those games developed tend to be facsimiles of other games which are twisted around the logic in some way. Which I don't think is, but indie game developers work within a lot of constraints. I get that. I don't think anything exists in the bottom category. I just don't think, I can't think of one game that has ever been developed with non-white people in mind. It just does not exist. And even in the context of the Japanese games industry, you could make an argument that there are games specifically made for the Japanese market. That's true. But that in itself is exclusionary. It is made for a specific market in Japan. They're not really meant to be played outside of that cultural context either. So it doesn't really answer that question because those aren't games which have any diversity locked into them either. You're just actually changing it to non-Japanese people at that point. It brings a different set of questions. Although there are definitely games there. Right. Got 5 minutes to go through this. I get the impression, which is weird to me, that a lot of you don't really know what Gamergate is about or what it is. How come? It was huge. You guys would have been about 13, 14. You were all online. You all had social media accounts. So I find it a little weird. That's all. And you don't know what it is about. Gamergate starts with a hashtag in August and September 2014. The Gamergate hashtag. Targeting Zoe Quinn, Brianna Wu, and Anita Sarkeesian, amongst some other women who were prominent in the games industry. Now, the root of it is Eron Joni, Quinn's ex-boyfriend, alleged an unethical relationship between Zoe Quinn and Nathan Grayson. Zoe Quinn is an independent games maker. Okay, makes a series of not wonderful games, but interesting games, I would argue. And interesting games in terms of sexuality and in terms of agency in those games as well. On the basis of this blog post that was made, that the argument was that Nathan Grayson was having a sexual relationship with Quinn and wrote a favourable article about her game Depression Quest on the basis of her relationship with him. Depression Quest, I think, is something that you can play fairly easily for free online. Quinn started to receive rape threats, death threats, etc. from the gaming community. Okay, very important here. Once this information was leaked out, it was like, gaming community, we're going to go into action here. We're going to stop this unethical journalism by giving death and rape threats to the woman who made the game, not the journalist. Journalists didn't get this, right? For Humphreys, this whole incident legitimised the culture of disrespect in gaming and in the industry. So culturally and in the industry itself, this whole incident gave a legitimisation to disrespect, because what it indicated was that gamers and gaming culture will rise up against any kind of imposition of women in the industry. Women in the industry are not welcome. Women in the industry should not be visible. Women should actually take this. As Brianna Wu argued, we're not people to this. Them refers to gaming culture and people who indicate they're in gaming culture, just objects to be hunted and bullied until we quit the industry. So they've actually given you a bit of background to it now. Many people in this accused Quinn of trading sex for positive game reviews. Well, there's a trope in itself about women, which isn't very welcome. Some actually defended Quinn and pointed out that the person in question had not actually reviewed her game, which was true. Weirdly, things became heated on both sides of this. Then you had 4chan piling in. Her Tumblr account was hacked. Now, guess what they did with her Tumblr account? This is 2014. You guys know Tumblr, right? What was Tumblr famous for before 2017?
Porn.
Thank you. Not necessarily just porn, though. People having a space to express body identity and sexual identity in particular ways. Now, Zoe Quinn didn't really take that opportunity, but she had uploaded a lot of content to the FTP on her Tumblr site, which she hadn't shared publicly. Once her site was hacked, they stole her nudes, of course they did, and distributed them far and wide, without her consent. So, we have a revenge porn aspect to this as well. Huge harassment campaign was conceived on 4chan and was followed on different platforms. On August 27th, the actor Adam Baldwin, what a piece of shit this guy is. You may not know Adam Baldwin. Does anyone, is it ringing a bell with anyone? His brother, older brother, is Alec Baldwin, who came to fame this year because he shot someone on a set with, they were supposed to have a dummy gun and it was actually loaded and he killed an extra. He was the first person to use the hashtag for the movement when he linked two videos attacking Quinn. So he was leading a pylon. His 190k followers quickly helped the hashtag spread, which then spawned websites, Reddit subthreads, additional 4chan and 8chan threads, and a sustained online movement. And those in the Gamergate movement allege that there is corruption in the video game journalism industry and that feminists are actively working to undermine the video game industry. So all these feminists who are making all the arguments that I've outlined today are actually working to undermine the industry itself. Their aim is not to bring diversity or to improve video games in any way, is to make it worse. And here's some of the responses. This is typical sort of discourse on here. So I've shown you Brianna's tweet, the famous one there. That is to Anita Sarkeesian, the one in the top right. I hope every feminist has their head severed from their shoulders. It's nice and measured stuff, right? Here's the part of the night where I call the police, because Brianna's actually responding to this. It's a bit small for you to see. I've got a K-bar and I'm coming to your house so I can shove it up your ugly feminist ass. Good to go, guys. Police just came by, husband and I going somewhere safe. Remember, Gamergate isn't about attacking women. From the account of death to Brianna, you just made a shitty video game nobody liked, that's it. Nobody will care when you die. Etc, etc, etc. I like the one at the end. If you have any kids, they're going to die too. I don't give a fuck. They'll grow up to be feminists anyway. So, I haven't selected the worst stuff. This is a judiciously edited piece. You can find extensive archives of all of this online. So, who were the people who actually being attacked here? Now, Anita Sarkeesian is somebody you will note on Canvas that I've used Anita's videos on a number of weeks of this module. I really like Anita Sarkeesian. I think she's an excellent video game critic. I think she's really sharp. And she knows what she's talking about. She knows the games industry and video games inside out. So her website and her YouTube channel, Feminist Frequency, really important source of an alternative view of how to view video games. She, in 2012, used a crowdfunding, we used Kickstarter to gather enough donations to finance a series of, if you like, short, informative documentaries, tropes versus women in gaming videos. So a hell of a lot of what I've been talking about today. She critiques the damsel in distress as a plot device, the limitations that come with the Ms. Male character trope, and the misuse of women as background decorations in the scene. Basically, Sarkeesian has brought a hell of a lot of research to light, which is important in our understanding of video games and the industry and how games are actually portrayed. Each new video that she released, this is before Gamergate itself, amped the hate on YouTube. Right from the outset, she was getting absolutely slammed on YouTube by gamers. Supposedly people involved in video games. Many used language which, one person went so far to use photographs of Sarkeesian to create a web game where you could simulate beating her to a bloody pulp, and posted links to that really crappy Flash game as comments on her YouTube videos regularly. Like, go on every hour and put a new comment on which was linked to this game. She got a load of death threats in 2014, which meant she had to go into hiding. In fact, she had to leave her home, go and live in hotels for a couple of months because she was scared for her life. In October 2014, called to give a lecture at Utah State University, which had to be cancelled because of a legitimate bomb threat. That not only was somebody prepared to kill Anita Sarkeesian for, let me be clear on this, for pointing out everything that I've pointed out this morning. That's all she did. Not only were they prepared to kill her, but also kill everyone in the audience. Are we seeing a problem here? Is anyone seeing a problem perhaps with some elements of the game's culture? Now, my argument is that Gamergate was the first shot in what has now become normal. Where we have discussions about culture wars, left versus right, Trump versus the rest of America, Brexit versus, Remain versus Leave. This was the first shot. The idea underpinning Gamergate was that gamers are persecuted. The white, male, straight gamers are under persecution from these women who want to come and change things. Is this true? Anyone want to venture an answer? Because I have an answer. Because they're talking about me, right? And you. You, Mason. Josh, they're talking about you. Do you feel persecuted?
Not really, but
It's like I did like that. I had to think about it for a minute. Benny persecuted.
I don't think I've sent death threats to any.
Well, that would be an indication that you don't really feel persecuted, because what I mean by this is those people who send death threats and so on argue that they are persecuted. Their argument is that gaming culture and the people who engage in it are under attack by women. Therefore, you need to respond by threatening to kill people.
No, I don't feel aggravated by women in the industry or women in the audience.
No, not me in particular. Not in any way, shape or form, actually. The presence of... I find all the things that Anita Sarkeesian points out really problematic, but I don't feel persecuted because women might play games. Fuck do I care? Kind of glad to hear it. You might get some better games. There's a lot of games are shit. Is male gaming culture misunderstood, though? I mean, when we engage in online games and, you're threatened and bullied and, you're given specific threats if you're a woman, is that a misunderstanding of culture? Is it just banter? Anyone who uses that word banter in my presence, you will understand it's not a threat. I'll fucking do it. I hate that word more than any other word in the English language because it just legitimizes bullying.
I don't think it's misunderstood, but from a guy's perspective, I think it's misused.
Yeah.
It's like if I go back to the COD kind of thing, they can say whatever they want over the phone and through the TV. To me, I do not care in the slightest. But then, like I said, when it flips to the female one, it starts becoming less funny and a lot more serious because it's just offensive and truly disgusting things.
And tapping into legitimate fears very often.
Things which, when it comes to us, like if we say to each other, it's fine, doesn't mean anything.
I mean, maybe the answer in that, Ben, is that we shouldn't accept it as fine. I guess, that we shouldn't laugh things off. Because when they're applied to other people, it's not a laughing matter, I guess. I guess you police behaviour by saying, well, it's not acceptable in any circumstance, but that's generally how we would, take... I mean, look, I have a group chat with Will Marin and one other person, and believe me, if that group chat was ever released to this institution, we'd both be fired. And we've often said this as well, we should delete this because we shouldn't say these things because we would be in big trouble. The underpinning thing of that is we both recognise that some of the things we say on that chat are wrong. And we would never do it at work. And we also recognise the wrongness. It's not me, it's mostly Will, right? But it's you've met him. So, he's not going to watch this, so yeah. But it's interesting that we will pull back and say, like, do you know what? That was a bit too far. We should really... We always write in apologies in a group chat which no one is ever going to see. It's in an encrypted channel, for Christ's sake. No one's ever going to see this, right? But there's a reason why I keep my phone in my pocket at all times. I don't know, is male gaming culture misunderstood? Be a hell of an argument for somebody to construct that, I think. I don't agree with that idea, but often that is it. Okay. Things that we need to think about to take this film forward, especially if you're going to look at it in essay 2, right? Or assignment 2, essay. Is gaming sexist and homophobic? Two very strong words. I think conclusive arguments can be built to support that. But, as with anything, is gaming like this or is society like this is important. If gaming is a reflection of society, then there are deeper, more endemic problems than just video games. If video games reflect society in particular ways, then the problem isn't necessarily with video games themselves. Albeit, that doesn't mean they're not fixable. You know, they can be fixed. Because games and gaming culture does not exist in a vacuum. You know, there are legitimate reasons why games have these things going on in terms of the economics of things. And if those are legitimate economically, then there is something problematic about society as a whole at that point. Because the industry, the product and culture exist in a wider context, but we could perhaps think about how gaming amplifies the worst of that culture itself. How it's perhaps looking at the lowest points of those culture and amplifying those tropes, which would be really problematic. Right, sorry for as always, time is meaningless to me, right? But sorry for going over. See you all next week. Don't forget, if you have things on Wednesday, there's a strike on Wednesday, so do check with your lecturers whether your stuff is on.